There are nights when the stories find you before you go looking for them, when the dark that gathers around the edges of your awareness carries something older than silence, something that has been waiting in the particular quality of stillness that comes just before the mind releases its hold on the day and begins to drift toward wherever it goes when the waking world finally lets it go. You may not be able to name it immediately. This quality of the dark, this texture in the air of the room, that feels different from ordinary quiet, heavier with something more inhabited, as if the absence of sound is not empty, but full in a way that sound itself rarely manages to be. And if you have been paying a certain kind of attention across the course of your life, you may recognize it. This is the feeling that comes just before a story begins. It is the same feeling, this receptive quality of the waiting darkness, that every human being who has ever sat around a fire at the end of a day has known. The fire goes low, the outer world goes quiet. The body, which has been doing the necessary work of the waking hours, begins, without being asked, without deliberate instruction, to release the tension that the work required, settling toward its easier arrangement, finding the weight of rest it has been earning since morning. And in that particular quality of loosening, in that particular quality of attention that comes when the demands of action have temporarily receded, something opens, a space, a readiness, the ancient human posture of the one who is about to hear a story, present still, attentive in a way that the busy hours do not permit, available to receive something that could not have arrived while the day was still fully engaged. You have been told stories all your life, and it is possible that until this moment you have never paused to ask what that means. Not what the stories were, not whether they were true or invented, or somewhere in the long, unmappable territory between those two things, but what it means that the impulse to tell them and the impulse to receive them are among the oldest and most continuous features of being human, features that predate writing and cities and agriculture and every institution we have built to organize the accumulated weight of what we know. They predate the wheel and the fired clay vessel and the domesticated seed and the calendar and the court and the temple. They may, some researchers now believe, predate language itself in its fully grammatical form, the impulse to narrative possibly running ahead of the capacity to express it, the brain wanting to make story before it fully had the tools to tell one. You are listening to Midnight Sleep Chronicles, and tonight our archives open around the oldest technology our species has ever possessed. Not fire and not the wheel, and not the tools of stone and bone we shaped with our hands, but something that shaped us even more profoundly than any of those things. The story, the told thing, the sound that one human being makes in the dark that causes another human being to lean closer and listen and be changed by what they hear. We have been making and receiving these sounds for longer than we have been doing almost anything else that we recognize as distinctly human. And the question of why, not just what stories do for us emotionally or culturally, but what they do at the level of the biology that underlies the culture, at the level of the neural tissue and the electrochemical processes that make experience possible, is a question that the science of this particular moment in history is, for the first time, beginning to answer with something like precision. Tonight, we ask, why do we believe in stories? And what is it that stories actually do to the creatures who tell them, not just to pass the time, not just to entertain or distract or comfort, but to survive, to remember who they are and who they might yet become? Let the body find its resting place now. Let whatever has been held today begin its slow release. We begin. It begins before language and before thought. and before the particular configuration of neurons that we call consciousness has assembled itself into anything that recognizes its own name. Deep in the tissue of the temporal and prefrontal regions of the brain, in circuitry that predates the structures associated with abstract reasoning by millions of years of evolutionary time, there is a system whose function is one of the most quietly extraordinary things that biological development has ever produced. The capacity to take disconnected events and arrange them into a sequence that implies cause and consequence, that transforms the raw, undifferentiated flow of experience into something the mind can hold, examine, anticipate, and act upon. This system does not ask permission. It does not wait for instruction. It is running continuously in the background of every moment you have ever lived, constructing and adjusting and revising the narrative of what is happening and why it is happening, and what, given what has happened before, is likely to happen next. Something in the mind wants to make story from everything, wants it the way the lung wants air, not as a preference, but as the condition of being able to breathe at all. Strip narrative away, and what remains is not clarity, not raw experience purified of interpretation, but something far more distressing. A cascade of sensation that will not cohere, events arriving without address, a present moment that cannot find its place in the story of a life, and therefore cannot be inhabited. This is known from the inside, by people who have lost the capacity for it, who describe not freedom from the scaffolding of story, but a world that has simply become impossible to live in without that scaffolding, a world where nothing follows from anything and nothing points toward anything, and everything simply arrives, disconnected and unreceivable. Not a luxury, the foundational condition of being able to live in the world at all. The neuroscientist Uri Hasson and his colleagues at Princeton University spent years placing storytellers and their listeners simultaneously inside functional magnetic resonance imaging machines and recording what happened in the brain as one person spoke and the other received the words. What they found has become one of the most cited results in the emerging science of narrative. When a story is being told with sufficient emotional and sensory detail, the brain waves of the listener begin to synchronize with the brain waves of the teller, aligning across regions far beyond the language processing areas, reaching into networks associated with emotion, with movement, with sensory experience, with the simulation of other minds. The listener does not merely understand the story. The listener, in a neurological sense that the instruments can measure and map, becomes the story, takes it into the body, runs it as a simulation, inhabits the events as if they were occurrences in one's own experience, rather than in the experience of someone else. This synchronization, this neural coupling, as Hasson called it, was not a marginal effect, not a slight correlation in a noisy data set, but a robust and reproducible phenomenon that tracked precisely with a degree of comprehension and engagement. The more fully the listener understood the story, the more completely their brain waves mirrored those of the teller. The brain of the listener anticipated the next word, the next event, the next emotional turn, firing slightly ahead of the arriving narrative, the way a hand reaches toward a familiar object before the eye has finished confirming its location. This process has a name in the literature. It is called narrative, transportation, and it is not a casual metaphor for engagement. It is the description of an actual neurological event in which the boundaries of the self become temporarily more permeable. The usual defensive distance between my experience and your experience narrows almost to nothing, and the events of the narrative register in the brain's sensory and emotional systems with something approaching the same intensity as events in the world outside. Your palms may sweat during a story. Your heart rate may change. The motor cortex, the region responsible for controlling voluntary movement, has been observed to activate in listeners whose bodies are entirely still, because the story is telling the brain that movement is happening. And the brain does not fully distinguish between the movement that is imagined in sufficient detail and the movement that is actually performed. The neurochemist Paul Zak spent 2 decades studying what happens to the body during this state of narrative absorption, measuring blood chemistry in real time as participants listen to stories of varying emotional quality and structural coherence. What he found was this: a story that builds tension gradually, that introduces a character facing genuine difficulty, that increases the stakes through a sustained arc, that brings the listener into sustained identification with the character's situation, triggers the release of a neurochemical called oxytocin, sometimes called the trust molecule or the empathy molecule, a compound that evolved in the mammalian brain to facilitate social bonding, to lower the threat assessment of other members of the group, to create the felt sense of safety and connection that makes cooperation possible. The brain, encountering a well-constructed narrative, behaves as if it is in the presence of a trustworthy member of its own community. It opens. It receives. It allows itself to be changed by what it hears. A story, in other words, does chemically what the most sophisticated social institutions do structurally. It makes strangers safe to one another, binds separate individuals into something larger than themselves, creates the shared interior world without which collective action of any kind becomes impossible. Zak concluded, after 20 years of measurement, that the most fundamental purpose of the human capacity for narrative is not entertainment, but social cohesion. The story is the glue that holds the group together across time, the mechanism that makes it possible for human beings to cooperate at scales that would be completely impossible for any species that could not share an interior world through language. This is not a capacity that developed recently. The evidence for it runs back to the deepest strata of human prehistory, to a time before any of the structures we associate with civilization had appeared on the surface of the earth, before the first seeds were planted, or the first kiln was lit, or the first mark was pressed into wet clay to stand for something other than itself. In 2019, archaeologists working in the caves of the Maros Pangkep Karst region on the Indonesian island of Sulawesi confirmed the age of a cave painting that had been known for some years, but whose full significance was only then becoming clear. The painting, rendered in red ochre on a limestone wall deep inside the cave system, depicting what appears to be a scene of a hunt, with animal-human hybrid figures pursuing large prey across the stone, was found to be at least 51,200 years old, making it the oldest known example of figurative art in the history of the species. And what the researchers noted was not merely the age, but the nature of what was depicted. This was not a record of a single moment. It was a scene, a narrative, a depicted sequence of events with implied characters, an implied action, an implied consequence. Someone more than 50,000 years ago. In the darkness of a cave lit only by whatever fire they had carried in from outside, pressed color into stone for what had to have been many hours, depicting not just what existed, but what was happening. Not objects, but events. Not things, but stories. In January of 2026, an even older hand stencil was confirmed on the island of Muna, dated to at least 67,800 years ago. So ancient that the makers preceded the arrival of modern humans in Europe by tens of thousands of years, reaching back into a time when our understanding of what it meant to be human was still being written, still in the process of becoming what it would eventually be. And yet there, in the darkness of the stone. The hand pressed through pigment onto cave wall. The oldest known gesture of marking, of saying I was here, of leaving a trace that would outlast the life it came from and be received, eventually, by minds that could not have been imagined. The drawings at Lascaux and Chauvet in France, which date to between 30 and 40,000 years ago, show the same impulse at work at a more elaborate scale. Animals in motion, overlapping figures that imply sequence and passage. Scenes that suggest not just observation, but interpretation, not just recording, but telling. The horses running, the bison turning, the painted hand reaching through time. Someone spent what the archaeologists have calculated to be over 400 hours carving a single lion-headed human figure from mammoth ivory in what is now southern Germany. 400 hours of labor in a community that was hunting to survive, whose members could not have afforded to spend that time on something without profound significance to the life of the group. This is not a community spending 400 hours on decoration. This is a community investing 400 hours in a story. And what kind of information was it? This information that was important enough to carry deep into a cave and render in colors that would outlast not just the artist, but every generation of the artist's descendants for 50,000 years. The cognitive scientist Lisa Kron offers an answer that is confirmed by the evidence of evolutionary neuroscience. The information preserved in stories was survival information, encoded in narrative form because narrative form is the only form the brain is genuinely equipped to store and retrieve across the necessary timescales. A simple command, "Do not eat the berries from that bush," lasts one generation, maybe two, before it fades from the chain of transmission. But a story, the story of the ancestor who ate the berries from that bush. What happened to them? How long they suffered, who found them, what the village did in the days that followed. That story carries the same information forward across 10 generations, 20, 100, because it is embedded in the architecture of cause and consequence that the mind finds most natural to hold, because the brain does not experience it as data to be memorized, but as an event to be remembered. And the event stays, the way the smell of something burning stays, the way the particular weight of certain moments stays, retrievable not as a fact, but as a felt thing, arriving whole when it is needed. The story is not a decoration added to the information. The story is the information, in the only form that the information can survive long enough to matter. And the remarkable thing, the thing that becomes stranger and more significant the longer you hold it, is that the brain knows this. In the way that the body knows things it has never been taught. Automatically, without instruction, in the deep layers below deliberate thought. In the same way that the lungs know to expand, and the heart knows to pump, and the immune system knows to recognize threat. Children who have not been taught narrative structures spontaneously organize their reports of experience in narrative form. Adults whose deliberate, analytical intelligence has been disrupted by injury or illness often retain their capacity for storytelling long after other cognitive functions have failed. The capacity for narrative appears to be not a learned skill, but a built-in feature. Not something the brain develops, but something the brain is. And so the species that learned to tell stories to one another was the species that survived the long, cold, dangerous night of prehistory. To arrive at this particular night, in this room, in this silence, that is not silence, but simply the world between one story and the next. The species that did not merely use story, but was made by it, shaped into what it is now in the image of the thing it kept telling itself in the dark. And there is something else worth noticing here. Something that the ancient traditions were pointing toward with their insistence on the communal, the gathered, the told in the presence of others quality of the story. When researchers placed storytellers and listeners side by side and watched what happened inside both of them simultaneously, they found that the two minds were not exchanging information across a distance. They were, in some deeper and stranger sense, briefly becoming continuous with each other. The patterns of one shaping the patterns of the other in real time, across the space of a room, across the distance that normally separates one person's interior world from another's. What the listener experienced was not the understanding of someone else's story. It was something closer to the temporary inhabiting of it. The boundary between hearing and living, between receiving and undergoing, becoming, for the duration of the telling, almost imperceptibly thin. This is what the campfire traditions always knew. The story is not a message sent from one isolated consciousness to another. It is a temporary dissolution of the wall between them, a means by which the otherwise impermeable space separating one person's interior experience from another's becomes, for those minutes of the telling, slightly more permeable than it usually is. Consider what this means for the earliest human communities gathered around fire in the dark. A story about where the dangerous river crossing is. A story about which season the big animals come down from the hills. A story about what the neighboring group did when the drought came 3 generations ago. These stories did not merely provide information that individual listeners could store and later retrieve. They provided something more powerful and more immediate. The actual experience of having been there, in the only form that experience could travel across the wall between one mind and another. The listener who had heard the story of the dangerous river crossing came away not merely with a fact about the river, but with something closer to a memory of danger, a trace of the wariness and the alertness that the original experience would have laid down, carried now in their own neural tissue as a consequence of the story, ready to be activated the next time the relevant situation arose. The mind does not fully distinguish between the lived experience and the story of the lived experience when the story is told well enough. The part of the brain that holds the archive of your life, that gives each memory its address in time and place, its position in the sequence of what has been, treats a vividly told story with many of the same operations it uses on actual events, encoding it not as abstract information, but as something that happened, something with a location in the landscape of a life, something that can be retrieved later, not as a fact, but as a felt memory, with the particular weight and texture of a thing that was lived rather than merely learned. This is why stories survive when facts do not. This is why the community that told stories around the fire was more likely to preserve its collective knowledge across the generations than the community that simply stated information in propositional form. And this is why the griot was not a luxury or an entertainer or a keeper of cultural decoration. The griot was the memory of the community in the most literal neurological sense, the source of the experiences that the community had never individually had, but needed to carry in their bodies as if they had, because the situations those stories described would come again. And when they came, the community needed to be ready, with a response shaped by the accumulated wisdom of everyone who had faced them before. Let that settle into you for a moment. And let the body continue its quiet work of releasing the day. And let the breath find its own slow rhythm. Because what comes next is older than the science that describes it, older, perhaps, than the caves themselves, and more patient, having waited in the living memory of those who carried it through everything that wanted to extinguish it. And the living memory, it turns out, has a name, or rather, a face, a lineage, a vocation that the oldest human societies recognized as essential as any other form of provision against the dark. There is a particular kind of human being who appears, with remarkable consistency, in every society on Earth for which we have sufficient record, whose function is so specific and so important that the role is almost always hereditary, passed from parent to child, the way a particular skill at stoneworking or boat building might be passed, but carrying with it something that goes beyond skill, something closer to vocation or calling or the particular quality of attention that a community reserves for those who are trusted with its most precious possessions. In the grasslands and savanna and river valleys of West Africa, where this role has its most fully documented and most richly elaborated form, this human being is called a griot, a word whose precise etymology is contested, derived perhaps from the Portuguese criado, meaning servant, or perhaps from older African roots that have not fully survived the passage through colonial transcription, but whose meaning in the communities where the role has been practiced without interruption for at least 700 years is far more complex than any single word can contain. The griot, also known as the Jelai, in the Mande-speaking communities of Mali and Guinea and Senegal, the Gaulo among the Fula people, the Guel in Wolof. This figure is at once historian and genealogist and diplomat and musician and what we would call in English a poet. Though that word carries a connotation of artistic marginality that the griot's role does not carry at all, has never carried. Because in the societies where the griot practices, the word and the music that carries it are not marginal to social function, but are its foundation, its load-bearing architecture, the structure on which everything else depends. The griot is born into the role. A child born into a griot family does not choose a vocation the way a child in another context might weigh the available options and select one based on temperament or opportunity. The choice has been made by generations of ancestors whose accumulated knowledge and cultivated capacity lives in the family lineage the way a river lives in its channel. Not as a possession that can be transferred to another bed, but as the natural expression of the terrain through which it has been flowing for centuries. The Diabaté lineage of Mali has been producing griots for at least 70 generations. When the musician Toumani Diabaté plays the kora today, he is not playing an instrument that he has mastered through individual talent. He is playing through the accumulated practice of 700 years of teachers and students who held the tradition against everything that might have broken it, who chose, generation after generation, to carry the word forward. Training begins at approximately 8 years of age, and it is total. The young griot learns not one repertoire, but hundreds. Stories and genealogies and praise songs and historical accounts that can run for hours without a single pause or a single word repeated, all held not in writing, but in the living tissue of memory, organized by rhythmic and melodic patterns that serve as the structural equivalent of the indices and cross-references that a written archive uses to make its contents retrievable. The mnemonic architecture of oral tradition is as sophisticated as any filing system that writing ever produced, and in some ways more robust, because a written archive requires the survival of its physical medium, while the oral archive requires only the survival of trained human beings, who are, in some respects, more durable than paper and more portable than stone. By the time a griot receives the instrument that marks the completion of training, typically the kora, a 21-stringed instrument whose resonator is a large calabash gourd, and whose sound has been described as rain on still water, combining the tonal richness of a harp with the rhythmic flexibility of a lute. The musician carries within them what no library of the period could contain: the living memory of a civilization, organized not as a list of facts, but as a web of stories, each connected to each other through the relational logic of narrative, each capable of being approached from multiple directions and retrieved in multiple contexts. To the community that the griot serves, And the griot always serves a specific community, a specific extended family, a specific lineage of kings or nobles for whose history the griot family has been responsible across generations. The griot is not a performer in the way we use that word. The griot is a steward, holding in trust what the community cannot hold for itself, keeping alive what would otherwise be lost, not because the community has forgotten, but because the community has no mechanism for remembering at the necessary scale and depth without this designated keeper of the word. The proverb that has become the most widely quoted description of this function was recorded by the Mali-born ethnographer Amadou Hampâté Bâ, who devoted his life to documenting the oral traditions of West Africa before writing was available to preserve them, and who said, in a phrase that has since been translated into dozens of languages and cited in as many contexts, "In Africa, when an old man dies, it is a library that burns." He was not speaking metaphorically. He was describing the literal mechanics of an information system in which the knowledge of a civilization is held not in objects or inscriptions, but in the living memory of trained human beings whose loss is the irreversible loss of what they carried. Not a copy of a text that exists elsewhere in other copies, but the original, the only version, the text that existed nowhere except in the voice and the memory that gave it life. The founding epic of the Mali Empire, the story of Sundiata Keita, who overthrew the sorcerer King Sumanguru Kante and established the most powerful state West Africa had known, a state that, at its height in the 14th century, stretched from the Atlantic coast to the central Sahel, controlling the gold and salt trade routes that connected sub-Saharan Africa to the Mediterranean world, was preserved and transmitted across 7 centuries, not in any written document, but in the memory of the griot lineage founded by Bala Faseke, the griot whom Sundiata's father gave his son not as a servant, but as a second self, a living complement who would carry what the warrior king could not carry and remember what the warrior king could not be expected to remember. The story of Sundiata begins not with a hero at the height of his power, but at the lowest possible point. A boy who could not walk, who was the object of ridicule and mockery, who seemed to give the lie to every prophecy that had been made about his greatness. The griot preserved this beginning, not despite its difficulty, but because of it. Because the transformation is not possible without the low point. Because the return is not possible without the departure. Because the story only teaches what it teaches if it is told in its entirety, with the darkness held alongside the light. And this brings us to the second great function of the griot, the function that may be stranger and more consequential than the first, the function that has no clear equivalent in any other information tradition. Because the griot, alone among all members of the court, was permitted to speak without diplomatic evasion to the king, to remind the ruler of precedents that were inconvenient, to name failures that power would prefer to ignore, to use the story not as flattery, but as mirror, holding up to the present the image of what had been done before and what had come of it. The praise song, which might seem from the outside to be simple flattery, simple political service to the powerful, was in fact a far more subtle and more consequential instrument. The praise song did not merely describe the virtues of its subject. It called those virtues into being by naming them in public, by holding them in the sonic space between the singer and the community, whose witnessing gave them weight, by making them real through the act of articulation and shared reception. The king who was praised for his justice was being told, by the keeper of the word in front of everyone who mattered, what justice was, and what it demanded, and what the failure of it had produced in the stories of every king who had failed it before. The praise was the contract. This understanding that the story does not merely describe a reality, but participates in creating it. That the named thing and the spoken thing are not passive representations of a fixed world, but active forces in the shaping of the world they describe. Was not unique to the griots of West Africa. It appeared, with a consistency that exceeds any explanation of coincidence, in traditions across the planet that had no knowledge of each other and no possibility of direct influence. In ancient Egypt, the creator god Ptah did not shape the world from pre-existing matter. He thought it, and then he spoke it, and the speaking was the making. The word and the thing were not separate events, but a single event. The naming and the being identical. The sound indistinguishable from the substance it described. The sun god Ra carried within him a true name. A name that was not the title by which others addressed him, but the secret identity at the root of his being. The name that was coextensive with his power and whose revelation would transfer that power to whoever learned it. The goddess Isis spent her full cunning and patience to discover it. And when Ra finally spoke it, delirious with the pain of the viper she had made from his own spittle and placed in his path, the world shifted. Because the name had changed hands, and with the name, all that the name contained. The Egyptians were not treating this as allegory. They understood it as mechanics, as a precise description of how power actually worked. Why certain words spoken in certain sequences, in certain contexts, produced effects that other arrangements of sound could not produce. In the Norse tradition, the runes, those angular letters carved into stone and bone and wood across the northern world, were not primarily a writing system in the sense we use that phrase. They were individual units of power, each one a name for a force in the world, a compressed description of a reality that could be activated by the act of inscription and the act of speaking the name aloud. To carve a rune was to invoke what the rune named. To know the name was to have access to the power that the name described. The god Odin hung 9 days and nights on the world tree Yggdrasil, wounded and without food or water. And what he was seeking, what he obtained at the cost of that suffering, was not a sword or a throne or a country, but a set of names. The runes, the words that named the forces of the universe, the knowledge of the names that are identical with the things they name. The word abracadabra, that syllabic relic of 100 childhood conjuring tricks, now safely drained of any sense of actual power, derives in one tradition of etymology from the Aramaic phrase that translates as, "I create what I speak." The magic word was not a formula that activated a power located elsewhere. It was the claim, it was the declaration, the assertion of a principle that every tradition of sacred language has returned to across the full breadth of human time. The word is the making. To speak the name of a thing is not to describe it, but to bring it into the fuller presence of the world, to claim it, to shape it, to give it the weight and the reality that the spoken name in the presence of witnesses provides. These traditions are not equivalent. They arise from different soil, express different cosmologies, serve different social functions, and in many of their specifics are mutually contradictory. But they are all pressing against the same limit, all approaching the same territory from different directions, all returning with some version of the same report. That the story and the reality it describes are not cleanly separate. That the told thing and the true thing are in a relationship more intimate and more strange than representation. That the voice of the keeper of the word is not outside the world but inside it, shaping it, making it, holding it together against the forces that would allow it to fall into chaos and silence. What all of these traditions are circling, from the griot of the Sahel to the priest of Memphis to the rune carver of the Norse coast, is the same intuition, carried in different vessels, expressed in different vocabularies, but pointing toward the same territory. That the story is not something added to the world from outside, a representation of a reality that exists independently of being described. The story is the mechanism by which the world is continuously made and remade, by which what might be becomes what is, by which the imagined and the real are not opposites, but phases of a single process that requires the human voice to move from one to the other. The Celtic peoples of Ireland and Wales and Scotland preserved this understanding in a form that has always struck me as particularly precise: the belief in the belief thin place. The location in the landscape where the membrane between the ordinary world and the deeper reality beneath it is notably more permeable than elsewhere. But the Celtic tradition also preserved something else, less frequently discussed: the belief that the bard, the keeper of the word in the Celtic tradition, the figure whose role paralleled the griot across the water, was one of the few human beings who could move between the ordinary world and the deeper one, not because of supernatural power, but because of a trained capacity. The capacity to hold a story in the mind with such completeness and such fidelity that the story became, for the duration of the telling, more real than the surroundings in which it was told. The bard's training in the pre-Christian Celtic tradition lasted, by some accounts, 12 years. The student spent those 12 years memorizing not just stories, but the rules of their structure, the meters and rhythms and formal requirements that encoded the stories in a form that resisted forgetting the way a well-constructed vessel resists leaking. Not through any magical property of the form itself, but through the practical principle that what is given shape is easier to hold than what is formless. The training ended, according to the records that survive, with the student spending a night alone in complete darkness, composing a new poem in one of the most demanding meters in the tradition, a poem that would demonstrate not just technical mastery, but something harder to specify and more important: the quality of genuine listening. The evidence that the student had learned not just to speak, but to hear, not just to tell, but to receive, not just to carry the tradition forward, but to allow the tradition to speak through them in a way that the purely technical carrier of information never quite manages. The Japanese tradition of oral performance produced something analogous in the art of the rakugo, storyteller, a performer who sits alone on a stage with only a fan and a small cloth as props and creates, through voice and posture, and the most economical possible use of physical suggestion, an entire world populated by characters who are entirely distinct from each other and from the performer, so distinct that audiences report seeing them even when they know, rationally, that there is only one person on the stage. The tradition has been practiced without interruption for 400 years, and the stories that make up its repertoire are the same stories that were told 4 centuries ago, transmitted through the direct line of teacher to student. Each generation learning the stories not from a text, but from the voice and the body of the teacher, receiving not just the content, but the performance, the specific timing, the particular quality of silence between words, the exact calibration of pace and emphasis that carries the meaning the content alone cannot convey. And what all of these traditions preserve, in their different vessels and their different vocabularies, is the same understanding. The story, in its full form, is not the words. The story is the event, the live, embodied, breathed event of telling and receiving, in which the teller and the listener are both changed by what passes between them, in which the story that existed before the telling and the story that exists after the telling are related but not identical, because the telling has added to it everything that the specific moment of its telling contained. the quality of the attention, the particular darkness or light, the weight of what the listeners carried in with them from the world outside. The specific way the silence before the first word felt different from the silence after the last. This is why the griot cannot be replaced by a written record, even when writing becomes available. Not because writing is less accurate. Writing may be more accurate in some respects, more literal, more reproducible in its exact form across time. But because the story in its written form is a score and not a performance, a map and not a journey, a record of an event and not the event itself. The event requires the live voice, the live body, the live breath moving between the keeper of the word and the one who receives it. Across the space of a shared darkness or shared fire or shared room in which two or more human beings are present together in the specific, irreplaceable way that presence makes possible. Let that rest in you for a moment, while the breath continues its quiet work and the body settles further into the ease that comes with full and unhurried exhalation. Because what comes next is not older than what we have been describing, but deeper, in the way that the root of a tree is not older than the tree, but is the part from which everything visible grows. And that root, it turns out, leads not outward into the world of myth and tradition, but inward, into the territory of the life you are already living. Joseph Campbell spent the better part of the 20th century reading every myth he could find, in every tradition for which he could locate a source. From the oldest Sumerian texts pressed into clay tablets in the 3rd millennium before the Common Era, to the stories still being told in the living oral traditions of cultures that had retained their narrative practices intact through everything that modernity had sent against them. He was a man of extraordinary patience and extraordinary range, comfortable in the Upanishads and in the Greek tragedies and in the dream interpretation of Carl Jung, and in the ceremonial practices of communities whose names most of his academic colleagues had never encountered. And what he brought to all of this material was not a predetermined conclusion, but a genuine curiosity about what was there, what kept appearing, what refused to reduce to, what anything simpler than itself. What he found, published in 1949 in the book that would eventually be called the most influential of the 20th century by some of the people who knew best what influence looked like, was this: the same story kept appearing. Not the same story in the sense of similar themes or shared motifs, or the kind of family resemblance that might be expected from cultures that shared geographic proximity or common ancestry. The same story in a more literal and more unsettling sense. The same structure, the same sequence of events. The same characters in the same roles performing the same function at the same point in the same narrative arc, appearing in traditions that had no contact with each other, no common source, no mechanism by which one could have borrowed from another. A figure who lives in the ordinary world. A call to cross a threshold into something larger and stranger and more dangerous than what is known. A journey into unfamiliar territory where the rules of the ordinary world no longer apply. A series of trials that strip away everything the figure thought they knew about themselves. Everything that had seemed solid, every certainty that had seemed permanent. A confrontation with the deepest fear, the most essential unknown, the thing that cannot be outrun or argued with or simply endured, but must be met directly on its own terms. A transformation that could not have happened any other way, in any other place, through any other sequence. A return to the ordinary world carrying something that was not there before. Not a trophy, not a prize, but a changed capacity. A new way of being in the world that the ordinary world before the departure could not have produced. Campbell called this pattern the monomyth, and what he proposed, the proposal that made scholars uncomfortable and storytellers quietly grateful. And readers feel that something they had always half known had been finally said in a form they could hold. Was that this pattern was not a cultural convention, but an expression of something in the structure of consciousness itself, something in the way the human mind processes experience and growth and change that finds its natural form in this particular narrative shape. The brain, as we have seen, is a story-making machine. But it is not a machine that makes any story at all with equal facility. It has a preference, and the preference is old and deep and not easily overridden. And it is for stories of transformation. Stories in which a being crosses from one state to another, in which the self that arrives at the end is not the self that departed from the beginning, in which something has changed that could not have changed any other way. George Lucas, in the years when he was trying to find the shape of what would become Star Wars, spoke of reading Campbell's book and feeling as though someone had finally shown him the map of a territory he had been trying to navigate without one. As though the pattern Campbell had found was not an external template being imposed on stories from outside, but the underlying grammar of story itself. The deep structure that every story, when it is working at its full power, is actually an instance of. Not the decoration, but the architecture. This is the story the brain wants to tell about everything. Not just about heroes and myths, but about meals and conversations, and the walk home from a place where something happened, and the morning after a night of decision, and the first day after the ending of something that had seemed permanent. The brain interprets your life as a story, continuously and automatically, fitting the incoming experience of each moment into the narrative arc it has been constructing since the first moment of self-awareness, adjusting the interpretation as new information arrives, revising the earlier chapters in light of the later ones, making meaning from the accumulation of events in the same way the griot makes history from the accumulation of days, not by recording everything, but by selecting what matters and arranging what is selected into a shape that implies consequence and direction. The psychologists who study what they call narrative identity, the branch of psychology that began with the work of Dan McAdams at Northwestern University, and has expanded over 30 years to encompass some of the most revealing and practically important research in the entire field, have found that the way a person tells the story of their own life is one of the strongest predictors of their psychological health. Their resilience in the face of setback, their capacity for sustained relationship, and their ability to find meaning in experiences that are not intrinsically meaningful in any obvious way. What they have found, in hundreds of studies across many years, is not that happy stories predict good outcomes, but that something more specific and more interesting. The people who describe their own lives in terms that include both difficulty and growth, who can locate in the hard chapters the seeds of the capacities that the later chapters required, who tell their own story with the structural sensibility of the monomyth: departure, difficulty, transformation, return. These people navigate the ongoing challenges of living with a fluency and a groundedness that the research consistently distinguishes from both the people who tell uniformly positive stories and the people who tell stories with no arc at all, no thread connecting the events, no sense of direction or consequence, or the possibility of becoming. The story is not merely a report on the life. The story is a force acting on the life, shaping what is noticed and what is retained, and what is reached for and what is possible. And here is the question that the philosophy of story has been asking for as long as there have been philosophers. If the brain constructs the story of a life from the inside, interpreting experience through the narrative it is building, then where does the story end and the life begin? If the story you tell yourself about who you are shapes which experiences you notice, which details you retain, which interpretations you favor, which futures you move toward. If the narrative is not merely a record of the life, but a determinant of it, a force that acts on the direction and texture of the actual experience of being alive. Then the question of what story you are telling, and whether that story is the one you would choose if you could step outside it and see it clearly, becomes not a philosophical luxury, but a matter of some urgency. The griots understood this. It is why the praise song was not flattery, but technology. The technology of naming, which is also the technology of constructing what the named thing can become. The griot who sang the courage of the king was not recording a fixed quality, but participating in its ongoing construction, holding the word in the space where the community could hear it, and the king could hear it, and the name could do its work of calling into fuller being what it named. The story that is told about you in the presence of those who matter shapes not only how they see you, but how you see yourself. And how you see yourself shapes what you reach for and what you avoid, and what you are capable of when the test arrives that reveals what has been quietly building in the years between the tests. This is the oldest technology of transformation that human beings possess. Not the technology of the body, not the technology of the environment, but the technology of the story. The capacity to change what a thing is by changing the story that is told about what it is, by placing it in a new narrative context, by giving it a different name, and watching the name, in time, reshape the thing it names. The epics of Sandiata, which the griot lineage has been carrying for 700 years, begins not with the hero in his strength, but in his weakness. The boy who could not walk, who was the object of mockery, who seemed to give the lie to every prediction that had been made about his destiny. The griot preserved this beginning not despite its difficulty, but because of it. Because the transformation is only possible if the low point is real. Because the return only teaches what it teaches if the departure was genuine. Every story worth telling has this shape, and the shape is the shape of a life lived with full attention to what it is doing, which is moving, always, through something, towards something, becoming something that could not have been predicted from the beginning, that requires the whole of the journey to understand. You are at a particular point in your story tonight, not at its beginning, because you carry too much accumulated experience for that. Too much of what has already happened embedded in the specific way you hold this quiet and this darkness. Too many chapters already written in the texture of who you have become. In the particular way your body holds tension and releases it. In the specific quality of attention you bring to things that have mattered to you and the things that no longer do. In the exact shape of what you find difficult and what you find easy. All of it the accumulated consequence of a story that has been building since the first moment of consciousness and that has arrived through every departure and every return it has required of you. At this particular night, this particular breath, this particular version of yourself that is lying here in the dark receiving these words. And not at its end, because you are here, breathing, receiving these words, still in the middle of the movement, still in the territory between one thing and the next, still in that section of the arc that the monomyth has always described as the ongoing middle, where the shape of the ending is not yet visible, but is already being built by every choice and every act and every story that is told. Each night before sleep, in the private language that the self speaks to itself when the world has gone quiet enough to allow it. The griots believed, and in this they shared the belief of every tradition that takes the power of the word seriously, that the story you tell about yourself before you sleep is not merely a summary of what has happened, but a kind of instruction to the self that will wake. Here is what you are. Here is what you have survived. Here is what the next chapter begins with. Here is the name that the community has given you and that you have given yourself. Here is the arc that your life is on, not as a fixed destiny, but as a direction, a tendency, a shape that the narrative has been building toward and that every day of living either confirms or revises. What story do you tell in the silence just before sleep? Not the story of what went wrong today, though something may have gone wrong. Not the story of what remains unfinished, though things remain unfinished. Not the story of what is feared, though fear is present, as it has always been present, in the space between waking and sleep, in the undefended hours when the mind loosens its grip on the managed self and encounters the larger and less organized territory beneath. But the story that is also true and also carries you forward, that holds what the day actually contained without reducing it to either failure or success, that names you with the name that is most accurate. Not the name of the worst thing that happened today, and not the name of the best thing, but the name of the one who was present for all of it, who moved through all of it, who is still here, still breathing, still in the story. The capacity to revise the story, to take a chapter that seemed like an ending and find in it the beginning of something else, to take an experience that seemed like pure loss and discover within it the seed of a capacity that would not have been possible without the loss. This capacity is not a gift that some people have and others lack. It is the human inheritance, carried in the same neural architecture that the first storytellers discovered could be shared across the fire, that the griots carried across the centuries in their trained and practiced memory, that the myths preserved in their unchanging structures while everything around them changed. The capacity to revise the story, to take a chapter that seemed like an ending and find in it the beginning of something else, to take an experience that seemed like pure loss and discover within it the seed of a capacity that would not have been possible without the loss. This capacity is not a gift that some people have and others lack. It is the human inheritance, carried in the same neural architecture that the first storytellers discovered could be shared across the fire, that the griots carried across the centuries in their trained and practiced memory, that the myths preserved in their unchanging structures while everything around them changed. The psychologist Dan McAdams, who has spent decades studying what he calls the personal narrative, the ongoing story that each person constructs and continuously revises about who they are and how they came to be that person and where the story is going, found something that struck him when he first identified it as almost too consistent to believe. The people whose stories of their own lives included what he called redemptive sequences, moments of suffering or difficulty that led, in the person's own telling, to something valuable, a new insight, a deeper relationship, a capacity that had to be earned through the difficulty in order to be genuine. These people were, across multiple measures and multiple studies, more resilient, more generative, more capable of sustained connection with others, and more able to find meaning in the ordinary texture of a life than people whose stories did not include this kind of sequence. And what was most revealing was not that these people had experienced fewer difficulties or suffered less. Many of them had suffered considerably. What distinguished them was not the content of their lives, but the narrative form they had found for that content. The way they had organized their experience into a story with the structural properties of the monomyth, with a shape that implied that what had been endured for something, that the suffering had been the departure and not the ending, that the return was still to come, or had already come, and was being lived now. This is the technology that the griot preserves and transmits and keeps alive. Not just the stories of the ancestors, but the model of how a human life can be understood. The template that says the difficulty is not the interruption of the story, but its deepest material, the raw substance from which the most significant chapters are made. The Sufi tradition, that sustained and technically sophisticated engagement with the nature of consciousness that flourished in medieval Persia and Andalusia, and reached its most exquisite formal expression in the poetry of Rumi and Hafiz and the mystical philosophy of Ibn Arabi, understood this principle through the image of the reed flute, the ney, which opens the Masnavi of Rumi with an image that has been traveling through the world for 8 centuries and shows no sign of arriving. The reed cut from the reed bed, crying its longing, its separation the source of the music that carries the longing of every separated thing. The wound is not healed before the music begins. The wound is where the music enters. The cutting, which from the outside looks like pure loss, is from the inside, the beginning of the capacity to carry a sound that the uncut reed, still in its bed, still in its ordinary wholeness, could never have produced. This is the story of every griot who ever carried a tradition through the disruption of empire, or the violence of colonization, or the slow erosion of modernity's preference for the written over the spoken, the stored over the lived, the permanent over the present. The tradition survived, not despite the difficulty, but in some fundamental sense through it. Because the necessity of keeping the word alive in the face of forces that wanted to extinguish it refined the practice, concentrated the attention of the practitioners, made of each transmission not a routine transfer, but an act of deliberate and sometimes courageous intention. And something similar is true of every human life, in ways that become available for examination in the particular quiet of a night like this one, when the day's urgencies have receded far enough to allow the longer view, the view that can see not just the chapter that is currently being lived, but something of the arc that the chapters are forming, the shape that is only visible when enough distance has accumulated for the pattern to become perceptible. Notice, if you will, the particular quality of what is present in you right now. Not the content of what is present, not the specific thoughts or feelings or residues of the day, but the quality of awareness itself, this quiet observing that is watching all of it from somewhere that is neither inside the content nor entirely outside it. The ancient traditions called this awareness by many names. The witness, the observer, the one who knows, the part of consciousness that is present to the story without being fully identified with any particular character in it. And what all of those traditions noticed was the same thing. This quality of awareness is not something that the story tells about you. It is what you are when the story's not telling, when the constructed narrative has gone quiet enough to allow the noticing of what remains when the construction pauses. This awareness has been here through everything the story has described, through every chapter, through every difficulty and every relief, through every departure and every return, through every night of lying in the dark and feeling the uncertain weight of what the next day will require. It has been here through all of it, not as a character in the story, but as the stillness in which the story has been unfolding. And it is here now, in this room, in this dark, as it has always been here. Not needing the story to justify its presence, not requiring the narrative to give it meaning, simply present, simply aware, simply the quality of knowing that precedes every story and remains after every story ends. Let the breath deepen now, and let the thinking grow softer and more permissive, the way it does at this hour, when the day has finally released its claim on the attention. And let the body do what the body has been doing every night of its life, without any assistance from the mind. The slow, progressive release of the held thing. the gradual return of the tissues to their easiest arrangement, the yielding of the weight to whatever is receiving it. Notice the hands, wherever they have settled. The hands that carried the day, that held whatever needed to be held, that reached and reached again through the hours that are now behind you. In the tendons and the small muscles, in the specific calluses and the particular suppleness that is the history of everything these hands have learned to do. The whole story of this body is present, not as memory, not as a file that can be opened and reviewed, but as the actual physical fact of what has been lived, pressed into the tissue the way the griot's repertoire is pressed into memory, inseparable from the one who carries it, alive, only in the carrying. Notice the jaw, the shoulders, the places where the day tends to lodge itself in the body, even after the mind has released it. Let those places release a little more, not through effort, but simply through the permission of noticing them, the way a knot sometimes loosens when you bring your full attention to it, rather than simply pulling against it. The readiness that the day required has already passed. The demands that required it are already in the past, already in the archive, already being woven by the sleeping mind into the story that tomorrow will be built from. The air moving through you right now has been part of other bodies, part of other breaths, part of the atmosphere of other rooms on other nights, when other people lay in their own particular darkness and listened to the sound of a voice telling them something they needed to hear. The first voice that ever told a story around a fire breathed air that eventually became this air, circulated through the atmosphere of all the intervening millennia, changed by every breath and every body it passed through, arriving here now, in this room, continuous with everything. You are changing it slightly in passing, and it is changing you slightly in passing. And neither of you is quite what you were before the exchange, which is how it has always been, which is the most ordinary description available of what it means to be alive in a world that is made of continuous circulation, continuous transformation of one thing into another, without any of it being lost. The iron in your blood was forged in the interior of a star that burned for millions of years and then ended in an explosion so complete that for a few weeks it outshone the entire galaxy that contained it. That iron traveled through the cold dark for longer than there have been living things on this planet, became part of the ocean, became part of the chemistry of living things, became part of you, doing the specific and irreplaceable work that iron does in blood, carrying oxygen to every cell of the body that is lying here right now, doing this work without any memory of the star that made it possible, without any awareness of the billions of years that separate that first forging from this particular night. Simply present, simply functional, simply the current form of something very old that is doing what very old things do. Continuing. The stories in your body were forged in the same way. In every human being who ever told one, who listened to one, who passed one on across a fire, or pressed it into stone, or sang it at a wedding, or held it steady through the disruption of everything that tried to silence it. You carry all of that, not as memory, but as the actual structure of what you are, the particular shape of how you make meaning, the specific way you understand your own life as a story with a direction, the capacity to hold the dark chapter and the bright one in the same account without losing the thread. You are the griot of your own story tonight, the keeper of what has been and the teller of what might yet be, and the one who holds the word in the living tissue of memory and breathes it out into the darkness and waits, in the long patience of the tradition, to see what the speaking makes real. The archive does not close. The fire does not go out. The word passes from one voice to the next, and from one night to the next, and from one generation to the next, changed by every telling. And yet somehow, in the way that matters most, always the same story. The story of the one who departed and was tested and returned, carrying what the departure made possible to bring back. Tell yourself a true story now. In the silence between these words and the first story that sleep will bring. Not the story that justifies, and not the story that condemns, but the story that includes, that holds the whole of today and the whole of the self that moved through today with the patience and the steadiness of the griot who has learned that no chapter of the story is the whole story, that the ending has not been written, that the silence after the last word is not emptiness, but the place where the next word will come from, when the rest that is gathering now has done its work and the morning arrives carrying its own story, its own word, its own version of the beginning that every ending eventually becomes. The story continues. It has always continued. It is continuing now, in the breath, in the dark, in the particular weight of this night, settling around everything that needs to rest. You are held in it. You have always been held in it. Good night.